Waitress kisses a millionaire in front of his family. The reason made him fall to his knees. The delicate clink of crystal glasses echoed throughout the ballroom at Astor Place, where Manhattan's elite were celebrating yet another memorable night. Between the polite smiles and whispered conversations, Rebecca Jensen nervously adjusted her uniform apron as she watched the Sterling family occupy the restaurant's main table. His fingers clutched tightly at the small photograph folded in his pocket, his only anchor of hope on that decisive night. Astor Place wasn't just another upscale restaurant in New York. Occupying the 20th floor of a historic building overlooking Central Park, the establishment was a symbol of status and exclusivity. For Rebecca, however, it was the stage where her life was about to change drastically. "Table 17, Sterling family," whispered Martin, the maitre d', as he passed by. "Be impeccable. It's the heir's birthday." Rebecca nodded mechanically, her heart hammering against her chest. Daniel Sterling was turning 35, and she had waited a decade for this moment. As she approached the table, her memories took her back to that summer in Hampton Beach when she was just 17 and believed that love could overcome any social barrier. "Good evening, I'm Rebecca, and I'll be your waitress tonight," she managed, in a surprisingly firm voice, as her eyes met Daniel's for the first time in 10 years. For a fleeting moment, something flashed in his gaze, a shadow of recognition quickly replaced by the studied indifference of the very rich. The family matriarch, Victoria Sterling, raised a perfectly shaped eyebrow as she looked Rebecca up and down. "We want the wine list first," Victoria ordered, without even looking directly at Rebecca. As she served her family throughout the evening, Rebecca struggled to maintain her composure. Every time he approached the table, his son Lucas lying in a hospital bed across town filled his thoughts. The 9-year-old boy with the same blue-gray eyes as Daniel was battling a rare form of leukemia. Between one dish and another, Rebecca observed the Sterling family's interactions. Daniel seemed distant, responding mechanically to his parents' comments about corporate mergers and expanding the family empire. His fiancée, Catherine Prescott, a Boston socialite, monopolized the conversation with elaborate plans for their wedding in 3 months. The time for dessert was approaching, and with it the courage Rebecca had gathered for weeks finally reached its peak. When he brought the birthday cake, his hands were shaking slightly. "Happy birthday, Danny," she murmured, using the nickname only she knew before leaning in and pressing her lips against his. The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine dropped her glass of champagne, the golden liquid spilling onto the white linen tablecloth. Victoria Sterling stood up abruptly, her face contorted in outrage. But Rebecca only had eyes for Daniel, who stared at her with a mixture of shock and confusion. "Security!" shouted Mr. Sterling, rising from his chair. "Wait!" Rebecca begged, pulling the photograph out of her pocket. "Daniel, this is Lucas, our son." Time seemed to freeze. Daniel took the photograph with shaking hands, his face losing all color as he recognized his own features in the smiling boy's face. "He's dying." Rebecca continued, tears streaming down her face. "We need a compatible marrow donor. I've tried every way to contact you over the last few months. Your lawyers, your company, even your social media. Nothing has worked." Daniel fell heavily into his chair, eyes fixed on the photograph. I have a son." "Yes," Rebecca replied, her voice breaking. "And he needs you now more than ever." Chaos ensued in the restaurant. Customers whispered and pointed cell phones captured the moment, and security guards quickly approached. Victoria Sterling tried to control the situation, ordering everyone to leave while Catherine sobbed dramatically. But none of that mattered to Rebecca. She had achieved what seemed impossible. Finally, Daniel knew the truth. The price would be your job, your dignity, and possibly much more. But for Lucas, she would risk everything. "Please," she whispered to Daniel, who still hadn't looked away from the photograph. "He's at Memorial Sloan Kettering, room 507. You can take the compatibility tests tomorrow." Before security caught up to her, Rebecca took one last look at Daniel. The man he once loved was there, lost between shock and revelation, holding proof. of a past he never knew existed. In his eyes she saw the same sparkle from that distant summer when they were just two young people in love with no idea of the twists and turns that fate had in store for them. As she was escorted out of the restaurant, Rebecca knew she had started a storm that would change many lives. But when you have a child fighting for their life, some storms have to be weathered no matter the cost. Daniel Sterling remained motionless. In his office at Sterling Enterprises, Lucas's photograph still in his shaking hands. Last night felt like a fever dream, but the image of the boy, her son, was real and undeniable. The digital clock on his desk read 7:30 in the morning, and he hadn't slept a single minute. The calls didn't stop coming. His mother, Victoria, had already left 15 voicemails, all with the same controlled tone of urgency. Catherine, his fiancée, alternated between hysterical tears and veiled threats to call off the wedding, but Daniel barely registered these concerns. His mind was stuck in 2013, that summer, in Hampton Beach, that would change his life forever. Rebecca Jensen. Her name now echoed in his memory with painful clarity. She was the girl from the seaside cafe with honey-colored hair and a smile that lit up the entire room. At the time, he was finishing college, enjoying his last few weeks of freedom before assuming his role in the family empire. Mr. Sterling. His assistant's voice over the intercom brought him back to the present. Your mother is here. Before he could respond, Victoria Sterling burst through the door, impeccably dressed in a Chanel ensemble, her Louboutin heels echoing on the marble floor. I've already spoken to our lawyers, she announced without preamble. That Waitress is obviously trying to extort us. Let's sue the restaurant for allowing such embarrassment and— Mom, Daniel interrupted, his voice surprisingly firm. Look at this photo. Victoria hesitated, reluctantly taking the photograph. His aristocratic face visibly paled. He has my eyes, Daniel continued. The same shape as Grandpa Charles's face. And that crooked smile. It's identical to mine. Daniel, honey, you can't be considering— He's dying, he cut in, standing up abruptly. A 9-year-old child is dying in a hospital right now, and there is a possibility that I may be the only person who can save him. Victoria sat up, her legs giving out slightly. Think about Catherine, the company, everything we've built. And that's exactly what you guys did 10 years ago, isn't it? Daniel asked, a sudden realization hitting him. When they rushed me to London saying it was a unique learning opportunity, it was because of her, wasn't it? His mother's silence was answer enough. Rebecca tried to contact me. Victoria looked away. There were some letters, phone calls. Our legal department handled the situation. Daniel felt his stomach drop. For an entire decade, his family had deliberately kept the existence of their own son from him. A son who was now fighting for his life. Sloan Kettering Memorial Room 507, he murmured, reaching for his coat. That's where he is. Daniel, please, Victoria tried one last time. Think about the implications. The press is already speculating. The company's shares fell 3% this morning alone. He stopped at the door, turning to his mother with an expression she had never seen before. You know what's ironic, Mom? All these years you and Dad have been pressuring me to give the Sterling family an heir, and all this time I've already had one. The journey to the hospital seemed like an eternity. Daniel barely registered the typical Manhattan traffic jam, his mind switching between memories of the summer with Rebecca and images of the son he never met. What would Lucas's voice be like? What were your interests? How many birthdays, Christmases, and precious moments had he missed? Upon arriving at room 507, Daniel found Rebecca sleeping uncomfortably in a chair next to the bed. Lucas was awake, leafing through a comic book. The boy looked up, and Daniel felt his heart stop. It was like looking at an old photo of yourself. The same gray-blue eyes, the same unruly brown hair. Even the way the boy frowned in curiosity was familiar. Hi, Lucas said shyly. Are you the man in the photo Mom always carries? Daniel swallowed hard, taking a tentative step into the room. Yes, I'm Daniel. Rebecca woke up to the sound of voices, her eyes widening when she saw Daniel there. She stood up quickly, smoothing her disheveled hair. You came, she whispered, disbelief and relief mixed in her voice. I should have been here a long time ago, Daniel replied, his voice breaking. I'm sorry, Rebecca. I didn't know. The moment was interrupted by the entrance of a nurse carrying a clipboard. Mr. Sterling, the medical team is ready to perform compatibility tests. Daniel nodded, but his eyes never left Lucas. The boy smiled. Shyly, and in that smile, Daniel saw a whole future that he almost lost. A future that still had a chance of saving. I'm going to do the tests now, he said mostly to Lucas. And then, if you want, we could talk a little. I have 9 years of stories to catch up on. The boy's eyes lit up, and for the first time since being diagnosed, Rebecca saw true hope on her son's face. The Sterling family's carefully constructed walls were beginning to crumble, and amid the rubble, a new story was about to begin. The Memorial Sloan Kettering Laboratory buzzed with activity as Daniel watched the nurse draw his blood for compatibility testing. Every second felt like an eternity, knowing that Lucas was just a few floors up, waiting for a chance at life. Usually the results are ready within 48 hours, explained Dr. Miranda Chen, a specialist in pediatric oncology, adjusting her thin-framed glasses. But given the urgency of the case, I asked for top priority. We will have an answer by the end of the day. Daniel nodded mechanically, his mind still processing the last 24 hours. His phone vibrated again, another message from Catherine. He ignored her just as he had ignored everyone else since the night before. Dr. Chen, he called as the doctor prepared to leave. What are the chances of me being a match? The doctor hesitated for a moment. Between parents and children, the chance is approximately 50%. But Mr. Sterling, I need you to understand, even if you are compatible, the donation process is not simple. It will require commitment, recovery time. I'll do whatever is necessary, he interrupted, his voice firm. Upon returning to room 507, Daniel found Rebecca talking quietly to Lucas, who was now asleep. The boy looked even more fragile in the morning light, his pale skin contrasting with the hospital sheets. He finally got to sleep, Rebecca whispered, tenderly arranging the blanket over her son. Chemotherapy makes you very tired. Daniel pulled up a chair, sitting on the other side of the bed. Rebecca, we need to talk about everything. She nodded, giving Lucas one last protective look before following Daniel to the small conservatory at the end of the hallway. The space designed to offer a moment of peace to patients and families was empty at that time of the morning. Why didn't you come to me when you found out you were pregnant? Daniel asked, his voice betraying the accumulated pain of a decade. Rebecca laughed humorlessly, running her hands over her tired face. Do you think I didn't try? I called your house every day for weeks. Your maids had express orders not to pass on my calls. I sent letters, emails. I even went to the Sterling mansion once. And what happened? Your mother took me in, Rebecca replied, her gaze lost in memories. She offered me a check for $100,000 to fix the problem and disappear. When I refused, she threatened to sue my family for harassment. Daniel felt his stomach drop. I was in London. Yes, conveniently sent across the ocean as soon as your family realized our summer fling was getting too serious. The silence that followed was heavy, heavy with the weight of 10 years of secrets and regrets. How was it? Daniel finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Raise him alone. Rebecca smiled softly, and for the first time that morning, Daniel caught a glimpse of the girl he had fallen in love with that summer long ago. Difficult, wonderful, scary. He's extraordinary, Daniel. So smart, so kind. He loves astronomy books and can talk for hours about constellations. He has a natural talent for chess. He won the school championship last year. Daniel drank in every word, trying to build an image in his mind of the son he never knew. Does he know about me? I always knew I had a father. I showed him pictures, told him about our summer together. I never wanted him to grow up angry or resentful. A soft sound of footsteps interrupted the conversation. Catherine Prescott, still wearing her dress from the night before, stood at the entrance to the conservatory. "So, it's true," she said, her voice shaking. "When I saw the news online, I thought it was some kind of extortion scheme." "Catherine," Daniel began, but she held up a hand, her engagement ring sparkling in the sunlight. "No," she cut off. "I saw the photo. I saw the boy. He's identical to you, Daniel." Rebecca stood up discreetly. "I'm going to check on Lucas." As soon as they were alone, Catherine collapsed into a chair. "What happens now?" "I'm waiting for the results of the compatibility tests," Daniel answered honestly. "If I'm a match, I'll make the donation. And then—" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. Daniel knew his answer would irrevocably change the course of several lives. "I can't pretend I don't have a son anymore," he said softly. "I can't ignore its existence just because it's inconvenient for our image or the family business." Catherine slowly removed her engagement ring, placing it on the table between them. "I think I always knew there was something incomplete between us. Something you were searching for without realizing it." "Catherine, No," she interrupted him gently. "You have a son who needs you. A story that needs to be rewritten. And I deserve better than to be a chapter in another love story." Before Daniel could respond, Rebecca came running into the garden, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Doctor, Chen is in the room," she said, her voice breaking. "The results are in." Daniel stood up abruptly, his heart hammering against his chest. Catherine also stood up, grabbing her bag. "Good luck, Daniel," she whispered gently, kissing his cheek before leaving behind not only the engagement ring, but also a future that now belonged to the past. Daniel and Rebecca quickly walked back to room 507, where Lucas was awake, talking animatedly with Dr. Chen about a documentary about black holes he had recently watched. The expression on the doctor's face made Daniel stop breathing for a moment. "Mr. Sterling," she said, a small smile forming on her lips. "We have a 98% compatibility." News of Daniel and Lucas's compatibility quickly spread throughout the hospital, bringing a wave of hope that hadn't been felt in room 507 for a long time. Chen explained the necessary procedures, but Daniel could barely concentrate on the words. His eyes were fixed on Lucas, who was smiling shyly, playing with a small toy telescope in his hands. "The marrow collection procedure will be carried out in 3 days," the doctor continued. "Mr. Sterling, you will need to undergo some preliminary tests and follow a specific diet until then." "How soon can I go home?" Lucas asked, his small but hopeful voice echoing through the room. Rebecca gently squeezed her son's hand. "We'll still have to wait a while, dear. The transplant is just the beginning." "Actually," Daniel interjected, clearing his throat slightly, "I was thinking about that. Rebecca, you've been working 2 jobs taking care of Lucas. You must be exhausted." Rebecca straightened in her chair, visibly tensing. Years of fighting alone had taught her to be wary of offers of help. "I have an apartment on the Upper East Side," Daniel continued. "There are 4 rooms, lots of space. It's 10 minutes from the hospital. Could you?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "You could stay there during the treatment. It would be more comfortable for everyone." A heavy silence filled the room. Lucas looked between his mother and Daniel, his eyes shining with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Daniel, I can't accept." "Please," he interrupted her softly. "It's not charity. It's the least I can do after all these years. And more than that, it's a chance to meet my son." Lucas held Rebecca's hand. "Can we mom that way you wouldn't have to take 3 buses every day to come here?" Lucas's innocent comment hit Daniel like a punch in the gut. The reality of the difficulties Rebecca faced daily in caring for her sick child, his son, made him feel a deep shame for all the privileges he had taken for granted. Okay. Rebecca finally agreed more from Lucas's hopeful look than anything else. But we need to set some clear boundaries. Of course, absolutely, Daniel nodded quickly. You will have complete privacy. I can stay in the guest room on the second floor. Dr. Chen, who had discreetly walked away during the conversation, returned with a stack of documents. We need to begin preparations immediately. Mr. Sterling, I will need you to accompany me for some initial examinations. Before following the doctor, Daniel stopped at the door. Lucas, is there anything specific you'd like in your new room? The boy thought for a moment, his eyes shining. Can I have a ceiling with stars, the kind that glow in the dark? Phosphorescent stars, Daniel smiled. Consider it done. I'll have them install it today. While walking through the hospital hallways with Dr. Chen, Daniel made a quick call to his personal assistant, arranging not only the installation of the stars, but also a complete renovation of the room to make it perfect for a 9-year-old boy with a passion for astronomy. The rest of the day passed in a blur of medical exams, phone calls, and arrangements. Victoria Sterling tried several times to contact her son, but Daniel kept his phone turned off. His priority was now clear: his son needed him, and nothing else mattered. At night, when he returned to Lucas's room, he found Rebecca sleeping in the uncomfortable armchair again. Lucas was awake, leafing through a book about planets. Hey, champ, Daniel whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed. What are you reading? It's about Jupiter, Lucas replied cheerfully, even though his voice was tired. Did you know it has 79 moons? Daniel smiled, feeling his heart squeeze. How could I miss so many moments like this? No, I didn't know. Tell me more. For nearly an hour, Lucas enthusiastically explained about the solar system, his small hands gesturing excitedly as he described the different characteristics of each planet. Daniel absorbed every word, every expression, trying to make up for a decade of absence in a single night. Rebecca woke up gently, watching the scene with a mix of emotions that even she couldn't define. Seeing father and son interact so naturally, as if the years of separation had never existed, was simultaneously wonderful and heartbreaking. I think it's time for bed, young man, she said gently, noticing Lucas's eyes starting to get heavy. Just 5 more minutes, he protested, through a yawn. I haven't told you about Saturn's rings yet. Daniel adjusted the blanket over Lucas, a fatherly gesture that felt surprisingly natural. How about we save Saturn for tomorrow? I promise I'll hear all about it. Do you really? Promise, Lucas asked, his eyes almost closing. I promise. And you know what, tomorrow when you wake up, your new room will be ready with a whole sky of stars waiting for you. Lucas fell asleep with a smile on his lips, and Rebecca couldn't help but notice how he looked even more like Daniel when he smiled, like that. Thank you, she whispered as they left the room, for all of this. Daniel shook his head. Don't thank me. I should have been here from the beginning. But I promise Rebecca that from now on I will be present in every moment. Not just during the treatment, but afterward as well. I want to be a real father to him. The words hung in the air between them, filled with promise and possibility. Rebecca knew the road ahead would be complex. There was much to resolve, many wounds to heal. But in that moment, seeing the sincerity in Daniel's eyes, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could build something new from the fragments of the past. The move into Daniel's apartment happened with surprising fluidity. The room prepared for Lucas exceeded all expectations, the ceiling covered with precise constellations, a professional telescope installed next to the panoramic window, and shelves full of books on astronomy. But it was the expression of pure enchantment on the boy's face that made all the effort worth it. That's the constellation Orion, Lucas exclaimed weakly from the wheelchair, pointing to the ceiling. Even though he was exhausted after the first preparatory session for the transplant, his eyes shone with excitement. Rebecca watched the scene from the doorway, her emotions conflicted. The apartment was immense, decorated with understated elegance that screamed ancient wealth. It was a completely different world from the small queen's apartment where she and Lucas lived, a constant reminder of the disparity between their lives. Miss Jensen, Martha the housekeeper Daniel had hired especially, to help them approached discreetly. "Dinner is served if you're ready." The dining room with its solid mahogany table and Venetian crystal looked too intimidating for a casual meal. Daniel, noticing the discomfort, suggested that they eat in the kitchen, a space that was still luxurious but more cozy. "How was the first session today?" Daniel asked, pouring homemade soup that Martha had prepared especially for Lucas. "Tiring," Lucas admitted, playing with the spoon. "But Nurse Amy let me choose the ice cream flavor later." The silence that followed was interrupted by the shrill sound of the doorbell. Daniel frowned. He wasn't expecting visitors. "Daniel." Victoria Sterling's voice echoed through the apartment, followed by the sound of heels on the marble floor. Seconds later, she appeared in the kitchen doorway, freezing at the sight of the domestic scene before her. "Mom." Daniel stood up, his tone warning Rebecca of the impending tension. "What are you doing here?" Victoria ignored the question, her eyes fixed on Lucas. The boy flinched slightly under the scrutiny, instinctively moving closer to Rebecca. "So it's true," Victoria murmured, her voice shaking slightly. He's just like your father when he was young." "Ms. Sterling," Rebecca began, but Victoria held up a hand, silencing her. "Please let me speak," she requested, her usual aristocratic composure wavering. I came here to try and fix something I did a long time ago." Daniel watched his mother suspiciously, but something in her expression made him hesitate. Victoria Sterling never showed vulnerability. "Lucas," Victoria addressed her grandson directly, for the first time her voice softening. "I'm your grandmother, and I'd really like to meet you if you'll let me." The boy looked at Rebecca, seeking guidance. She nodded slightly, although her posture remained tense. "Do you like astronomy?" Lucas asked shyly. A genuine smile, something rare, lit up Victoria's face. "Actually, your grandfather Charles had an observatory at our country house. He used to take Daniel stargazing when he was little." "True," Lucas and Daniel asked simultaneously, making Rebecca stifle a laugh. Victoria removed something from her mess bag, a yellowed, visibly old envelope. "Daniel, this came to you 10 years ago. I never delivered it." Daniel took the envelope with shaking hands, immediately recognizing Rebecca's handwriting. The date showed that it had been sent 2 weeks after his departure for London. "There were others," Victoria continued, her voice low. "Many others. I kept them all. They're in a box in my office." Rebecca stood up abruptly, her hands shaking. "Lucas, honey, I think it's time for your meds." "But Mom, please," she insisted softly, helping him to his feet. When mother and son left the kitchen, Daniel opened the envelope. The letter inside was stained with old tears, the ink slightly smudged in places. "Danny, I am pregnant. I know your family won't approve, but this baby is our miracle. Please come back. I need you. Love, Rebecca." Daniel closed his eyes, trying to contain the wave of emotions that coursed through him. "Why, Mom?" "Because it was what we thought was best for you," Victoria replied, unshed tears shining in her eyes. "We were so worried about the family name, the future of the company. We didn't realize we were destroying something precious." Martha discreetly withdrew, leaving mother and son alone in the kitchen. 10 years, Daniel murmured. 10 years of memories I'll never get back. "I know," Victoria replied softly, "and no apology will be enough. But maybe we can start making new memories. All of us." In the hallway, Rebecca leaned against the wall, Victoria's words echoing in her ears. Lucas in his arms had fallen asleep, exhausted from the intense day. "Rebecca," Daniel called, finding her in the hallway. "Are you well?" She nodded, unable to speak. Daniel gently took Lucas from his arms, carrying him to the new room. Together they watched their son sleep under the artificial starry sky. "Tomorrow will be a new day," Daniel whispered, his hand finding Rebecca's in the dim light. "For all of us." And beneath the phosphorescent stars, a new family constellation began to form, shining with the promise of a future none of them had dared to imagine before. The first week in Daniel's apartment established a routine that, although challenging, brought a sense of normalcy that had been missing in Lucas's life for a long time. Mornings began early with visits to the hospital for transplant preparations, followed by quieter afternoons, where father and son gradually discovered each other. Rebecca watched this approach with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. Daniel had proven tireless in his efforts to make up for lost time, but the shadows of the past still hung over them like lingering clouds before a storm. "Breakfast is served," Martha announced, placing a plate of pancakes decorated with fresh fruit in front of Lucas. The boy, paler after the last preparatory session, managed a weak smile. "Thanks, Martha," he murmured, poking his fork half-heartedly at his food. Daniel entered the kitchen already dressed for work in an impeccable suit, but his expression changed when he saw his son's haggard expression. "Everything okay, champ?" "Just a little sick," Lucas replied, pushing the plate away. "Dr. Chen said it's normal." Rebecca gently touched her son's forehead, checking his temperature. "Maybe we should postpone visiting the observatory today." "No," Lucas protested, sitting up straighter. "You promised Dad. It's meteor night." Daniel exchanged a worried look with Rebecca. They had planned to take Lucas to the Hayden Observatory at the American Museum of Natural History, where a special event would celebrate the Perseid meteor shower. It was the first activity they would do together outside the apartment hospital circuit. "How about we do it like this?" Daniel suggested, sitting down next to his son. "We rest during the day, and if you feel better at night, we'll go watch the meteors. I promise we'll find a way, even if we have to turn your room into a private observatory." The compromise seemed to calm Lucas, who finally started snacking on his pancakes. Rebecca took the moment to check her messages 3 more shifts. At the restaurant had been cancelled due to her prolonged absence. "Is there a problem?" Daniel asked quietly, when Lucas got distracted talking to Martha about constellations. "Nothing important," Rebecca replied, automatically putting away her cell phone. Years of forced independence had taught her to deal with her problems alone. "Rebecca," Daniel insisted gently, "we're a team now. Please let me help." Something about the sincerity of his words made her defenses lower slightly. "I missed a few more shifts at the restaurant, with the hospital bills piling up." "Stop," he interrupted her. "You don't need to worry about that. I've already spoken to the hospital. All treatment is covered." "Daniel, I can't accept—" "He's my son too," Daniel said firmly. "And I have 10 years of fatherly responsibilities to make up for it." The moment was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Martha went to answer it and returned accompanied by Victoria Sterling carrying an antique wooden box. "Good morning." She greeted her presence, still causing some tension in the room. "Lucas, honey, I brought something that I think will interest you." The boy watched curiously as his grandmother opened the box, revealing an antique, polished brass telescope. "This telescope belonged to your great-grandfather Charles." Victoria explained, her fingers caressing the metal lovingly. "He used to use it to teach his father astronomy when he was little." Lucas's eyes widened. "It's so pretty, can we use it?" "Tonight, to see the meteors." Victoria cast a questioning look at Rebecca and Daniel, who briefly explained the plans for the observatory. Actually, Victoria hesitated, something rare in her normally assertive personality. The family's country house has a perfect vantage point for the Perseids. The private observatory I mentioned is still there, fully equipped. If you want. The invitation hung in the air, full of unspoken meanings. It was more than just an invitation to see shooting stars. It was an offer of reconciliation, a chance to heal old wounds. It would be more comfortable for Lucas. Daniel considered aloud, looking at Rebecca. He could rest during the journey, and the mountain air might do him good. Rebecca studied her son's hopeful face, then the antique telescope that represented a family heirloom that Lucas deserved to know. Okay, but we need Dr. Chen's approval first. The morning turned into a sequence of preparations. The doctor, after some adjustments to the medication schedule, approved the short trip, as long as Lucas rested adequately and returned the next day for his exams. While they were packing a small suitcase for the night, Rebecca found Daniel standing in the doorway of Lucas's room, staring at the starry ceiling. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "How different things could have been," he replied, his gaze distant. "All the starry nights we missed, all the discoveries we could have shared. We can't change the past," Rebecca said, surprising herself with the gentleness in her voice. "But we can make the present count." Daniel turned to her, his eyes carrying an intensity that made her breath catch. "I promise I'll make every moment count from now on. For Lucas and—" He hesitated. "For us too, if you'll let me." The moment was interrupted by Lucas, who entered the room carrying his great-grandfather's telescope as if it were the most precious of treasures. "I'm ready," he announced, his enthusiasm momentarily overcoming his exhaustion. As they watched, their son carefully examine each part of the ancient instrument, Daniel and Rebecca shared a look of mutual understanding. Perhaps under the same starry sky that brought them together a decade ago, they could begin to rebuild not only Lucas's health, but also the bonds that time and circumstance had tried to break. The Sterling's country home, nestled in the hills of Westchester County, stood amidst ancient trees as a silent testament to generations of family history. During the hour-long drive from Manhattan, Lucas slept in the back seat of Daniel's Range Rover, his head resting on Rebecca's lap, while his great-grandfather's telescope rested carefully beside him. Victoria was waiting for them at the entrance to the property, having arrived earlier to supervise the preparations. The Victorian mansion with its turrets and arched windows looked like something out of a fairy tale. But it was the observatory, a circular copper and glass structure at the highest point on the property, that immediately captured Lucas's attention when he woke up. "It's even more amazing than in Grandpa Charles's photos," he exclaimed, his energy momentarily renewed with enthusiasm. "Let's go in first," Rebecca suggested, noticing her son's paleness. "You need to get some rest before night." The interior of the house maintained the Sterling's signature elegance, but in a more welcoming way than their Manhattan apartment. Old photographs adorned the walls, silently telling the family's story through the decades. "This is of your father when he was about your age," Victoria explained to Lucas, indicating a sepia photograph of a young Daniel observing through the same telescope that now belonged to his grandson. Lucas studied the image with fascination. "He also had messy hair like me." Daniel laughed, messing up his son's hair even more. "Your grandmother used to go crazy trying to make me look presentable for family photos." "I still am," Victoria commented dryly, but there was a smile in her eyes that softened her words. The afternoon passed peacefully, with Lucas resting in the room that had been Daniel's as a child. Rebecca took advantage of the quiet time to explore the gardens, finding a small stone bench under an ancient oak tree. "I thought I'd find you here," Daniel said, approaching with 2 cups of tea. "It was my favorite place to escape when family expectations were too much." Rebecca accepted the cup, allowing the heat to warm her hands. "It's peaceful here. Different from the city." "Rebecca," Daniel began, sitting down next to her, "there's something I need to tell you." She tensed slightly, years of disappointments having taught her to fear conversations that began like this. "I resigned from Sterling Enterprises." The cup shook in his hands. "What, why?" "Because I realized I spent the last decade living the life my parents planned for me," he explained, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I lost the first 9 years of my son's life because I put family expectations above everything else. I won't make the same mistake now." "But Daniel, the company is your legacy." "No," he interrupted her gently. "Lucas is my legacy, and you—" He hesitated, turning to face her. "You are the only person who—" has made me feel truly alive. The moment was interrupted by Martha, who appeared in the garden. Young Lucas is awake and asking for you. Dr. Chen called to remind you of your medication schedule. Night fell softly over the estate, bringing with it the promise of the Perseids. Victoria had prepared the observatory cleaning equipment that hadn't been used in years and providing comfortable reclining chairs so they could observe the sky. Great-grandfather Charles's telescope works perfectly with modern equipment, Lucas excitedly explained to Rebecca, demonstrating an astonishing knowledge of astronomy. Grandma Victoria said we can use it to track the meteors. Daniel watched the interaction with a smile, marveling at how his son had inherited not only his looks, but also his passion for the cosmos. Victoria, sitting discreetly in a corner of the observatory, seemed equally enchanted. When the first meteor streaked across the sky, Lucas let out an exclamation of pure joy. "Did you see it? It was incredible." "Make a wish," Rebecca whispered, hugging her son. Lucas closed his eyes for a moment, concentrating. When he opened them again, there was a mature determination in his gaze that made everyone's hearts tighten. "I don't need to order," he said simply. "I already have everything I ever wanted." Victoria hid a tear while Daniel swallowed hard. Rebecca squeezed her son's hand, unable to speak through the lump in her throat. As the night progressed, more meteors crossed the sky, each one seeming to carry with it the hopes and fears of that rebuilding family. Lucas eventually fell asleep in his father's arms, exhausted but happy. "I'm going to take him to bed," Daniel whispered, getting up carefully so as not to wake his son. Rebecca followed him into the bedroom, helping to settle Lucas into the old bed that had once been his father's. When they finished, they stood in the doorway watching their son sleep. "Thank you," Rebecca murmured. "For what?" "For not giving up. For fighting for him even after all this time." Daniel gently touched her face, a gesture as familiar as it was distant. "I'm fighting for all of us, Rebecca. If you'll give me a chance." A particularly bright meteor lit up the room through the window, as if the universe itself was blessing that moment of reconnection. In the silence of the night, under the same sky that had witnessed their first love, Daniel and Rebecca met again, no longer as teenagers in love, but as adults who had learned the true value of love and family. And while Lucas slept peacefully, dreaming of shooting stars and ancient telescopes, the future began to unfold in brighter colors than any of them had dared to hope. The morning after the night of the Perseids brought with it a sense of change that hung in the air of the Sterling mansion. Lucas was still sleeping soundly when Daniel found Rebecca on the porch watching the sunrise with a cup of coffee in her hands. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, joining her on the antique wooden bench. "I was thinking about everything that happened in the last few weeks," she replied, her gaze lost on the horizon. "Sometimes it feels like I'm living a dream that I'm going to wake up from at any moment." "I understand," Daniel said softly. "But this is real, Rebecca, and we need to talk about what happens after the transplant." The mention of the procedure made Rebecca visibly tense. In 2 days, Daniel and Lucas would enter the hospital to begin the process that could save their son's life. Dr. Chen had explained in detail the risks and the long recovery period that awaited them. "Mr. Sterling," Martha interrupted gently. "There's a call from the office. They say it's urgent." Daniel sighed, standing up. "It must be about my dismissal. I'll be back soon." As he walked away, Victoria appeared on the porch, looking strangely hesitant, a rare trait for the Sterling matriarch. "Rebecca, can I join you?" Rebecca's silent nod was met with a small smile. Victoria sat up elegantly, adjusting her silk robe. "You know," she began, "spending the night watching Lucas made me realize how much I've deprived myself of over the last 9 years. How many firsts I've missed. How many smiles I've missed." "You made your choices," Rebecca replied, but without the bitterness she would have shown weeks ago. "Yes, and they were terrible choices," Victoria admitted, surprising Rebecca with her frankness. "But I'd like to do it differently now, if you'll let me." Before Rebecca could respond, they heard Lucas's excited voice coming from inside the house. "Dad, look, I managed to capture one of the shooting stars with the telescope camera." The two women watched through the window as Daniel enthusiastically examined the photos on Lucas's tablet, both hunched over the equipment with identical expressions of concentration. "He has so much of Daniel as a child," Victoria murmured. "The same insatiable curiosity, the same sparkle in your eyes when you discover something new." "It's scary sometimes," Rebecca agreed. "Seeing so many of his traits in Lucas." "Rebecca." Victoria turned to face her directly. "I know I don't have the right to ask this, but after the transplant, after Lucas is recovered, stay. Not just for Daniel or Lucas, but because you are family. You always have been, even when I tried to deny it." The sincerity in Victoria's words took Rebecca by surprise. Before he could formulate a response, Daniel returned to the porch, his face tense. "The council is calling an emergency meeting," he announced. "They want to discuss my departure and the succession of the company." "When?" Victoria asked, standing up. "This afternoon. But I'm not going. Lucas needs to return to the hospital for the last tests before the transplant." "I can take him," Rebecca offered. "Martha can accompany us, and you resolve the company's issues." Daniel hesitated, clearly torn between his responsibilities. "Dad," Lucas called again, appearing on the porch still in his pajamas. "Come and see, there are more photos." "Champion." Daniel knelt down to be at his son's level. "I need to take care of some important things this afternoon. Your mom is going to take you to the hospital for tests, okay?" The disappointment on Lucas's face was momentary, quickly replaced by understanding. "Okay. But do you promise you'll be there tomorrow?" "Not even an army would stop me," Daniel assured, hugging his son. The following hours were filled with preparations for returning to the city. While Lucas carefully packed his great-grandfather's telescope, helped by Rebecca watched Daniel prepare for the meeting. "Are you sure about leaving the company?" she asked, watching him adjust his tie in the mirror. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life," he replied, turning to her. "Rebecca, I spent years building what I thought was important, a career, a reputation, a corporate legacy. But none of that matters compared to what's really worth it, our family." The word "our" made Rebecca's heart race. Daniel walked over, taking your hands in his. "I know there is still a lot for us to resolve, a lot to rebuild," he continued. "But I want to do it right this time. No family pressures, no social expectations. Just us building something real and true." The moment was interrupted by Lucas, who ran into the room. "Mom, Grandma Victoria said we can take the telescope to the hospital. She said it has a perfect view of the Orion constellation from the rooftop garden." Rebecca and Daniel exchanged a meaningful look, both recognizing how drastically their lives had changed in such a short time. From a past of secrets and separations, they were building a future where the stars were not just distant points in the sky, but witnesses of a family reconnecting, healing, redefining themselves. The road ahead would still be challenging: the transplant, the recovery, the necessary adjustments to their lives. But for the first time in a decade, all the members of the Sterling family were united by a common purpose: their love for a boy who, like the stars he so admired, had brought light to the darkness of their separate lives. Memorial Sloan Kettering has never looked more intimidating than it did on that Monday morning. Rebecca held Lucas's hand tightly as they walked through the family hall, Martha a few steps behind, carrying her great-grandfather Charles's telescope, which Lucas had insisted on bringing for good luck during his exams. "Mr. Lucas Sterling," the nurse called, consulting her clipboard. The use of the surname Sterling made Rebecca blink in surprise. It was the first time she had heard her son called that. "Present," Lucas replied excitedly, despite the paleness on his face. "Can I take my telescope?" The nurse smiled gently. "Of course, honey. But first we need to do some important tests, okay?" As Lucas was taken to the collection room, Rebecca found a familiar spot in the waiting area. Martha sat discreetly on the other side, maintaining a respectful distance that Rebecca appreciated. Miss Jensen, a familiar voice called her. It was Catherine Prescott Daniels' ex-fiancée standing a few feet away with an uncertain expression on her face. Rebecca felt her body tense. Catherine. "Can I sit down?" she asked, indicating the empty chair next to her. After a moment of hesitation, Rebecca nodded. "I came to make a bone marrow donation," Catherine explained, noticing Rebecca's questioning look. "After that night at the restaurant, I signed up for the donor bank. I thought, well, even if I'm not a match for Lucas, maybe I can help another child." The confession took Rebecca by surprise. "That's very kind of you." "You know," Catherine continued, her elegant hands toying nervously with the strap of her Chanel bag, "I always knew there was something incomplete about Daniel. A void that no amount of professional success or social commitment could fill. Now I understand why." Rebecca remained silent, absorbing the words. "He smiles differently now," Catherine observed. Truer, as if he had finally found his place in the world. Before Rebecca could respond, her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Meeting ending. How's our boy?" The use of the word, "our," made his heart quicken just as it had at the mansion. She responded quickly, informing about the ongoing exams. "Rebecca," Catherine called softly, standing up. "Take good care of them. The Sterlings are masters at hiding their feelings, but when they love deeply." The afternoon progressed with a series of exams and consultations. Lucas, although tired, kept his spirits high, sharing his astronomical knowledge with anyone willing to listen. "Did you know that there are more stars in the universe than there are grains of sand on all the beaches on Earth?" he explained enthusiastically to Dr. Chen, who smiled as she checked her results. "The numbers look good, Doctor informed Rebecca. "We are ready to proceed with the transplant tomorrow as planned." The weight of that reality hit Rebecca full force. Tomorrow her son would face the procedure that could save his life, or... "Mom," Lucas called, noticing her expression. "Everything is fine." Rebecca forced a smile. "Of course, honey. Just thinking about how brave you're becoming." "Like an astronaut," he exclaimed. "They also have to be very brave to explore the unknown." The office door opened, revealing Daniel still in his meeting suit, although his tie was loose, and his hair was messy from nervously running his hands. "Dad," Lucas shouted excitedly. "Weren't you going to sort out important things?" "I've already decided," Daniel replied, hugging his son. "And there's nothing more important than being here with you." Rebecca noticed something different in his expression. "How was the meeting?" "Interesting," he replied with a small smile. "The board wasn't exactly happy with my decision to step aside, but we reached an agreement. I will keep my shares in the company, but without direct involvement in management." "And is that good?" Lucas asked curiously. "It's perfect," Daniel replied, ruffling his son's hair. "It means I'll have all the time in the world to explore the stars with you." Dr. Chen cleared her throat softly, catching everyone's attention. "We need to discuss procedures for tomorrow. Lucas, how about showing Martha your telescope while I talk to your parents?" After Lucas left, the doctor detailed the transplant process, the risks involved, and the long recovery period that awaited them. Rebecca held Daniel's hand tightly throughout, the explanation finding strength in his touch. "Any questions?" Dr. Chen concluded. "Just one," Daniel replied. "When can we start?" The determination in his voice made Rebecca look at him with new eyes. This was no longer the privileged young man he had known in Hampton Beach, nor the distant executive that the Sterling family had molded. This was a father willing to move mountains for the son he had just met. When they left the hospital that night, the Manhattan sky was exceptionally clear. Lucas insisted on stopping by the rooftop garden for one last observation before tomorrow. "Look," he exclaimed, adjusting his telescope. "It's Vega. It's one of the brightest stars we can see from Earth." Daniel and Rebecca watched their son with a mixture of love and apprehension. Tomorrow their lives would change forever. But at that moment, under the starry sky of New York, They were just a family, united by the love of a boy who liked the stars. He admired so much shined brightest in the darkest hours. "Are you ready for tomorrow, champ?" Daniel asked softly. Lucas nodded without taking his eyes off the telescope. "There. And you know what, I'm not scared at all. Because now I have you. Both with me." Rebecca felt the tears she had been holding back all day finally escape. Daniel put one arm around her, keeping the other around Lucas, and together they stood there, a private constellation beneath the vast night sky. Memorial Sloan Kettering was waking up before the sun even rose. In the pediatric ward, the medical team meticulously prepared for the transplant that could change the Sterling Jensen family's lives forever. Daniel had already been in the operating room since 5 in the morning, starting the marrow collection process, while Rebecca remained next to Lucas in his room. "Tell me again how you and Daddy met," Lucas asked, his voice small but curious as the nurse adjusted his IV line. Rebecca smiled, adjusting the hospital blanket over her son. "It was at a beachfront coffee shop in Hampton Beach. I worked there during the summer, and your dad came in one day completely lost looking for a decent coffee. And it was love at first sight?" he asked, his eyes shining with the same intensity as Daniel's. "Actually," she laughed softly, "I accidentally spilled hot coffee on him. He was so distracted looking at the sea that he didn't notice when I approached with the coffee pot." Victoria Sterling, who had just entered the room carrying a small box, stopped to listen to the story. "I never knew how you guys met," she admitted, sitting on the other side of Lucas's bed. "What's in the box, Grandma?" Lucas asked curiously, momentarily forgetting his anxiety about the procedure. Victoria carefully opened the box, revealing a small, golden star-shaped brooch. "This brooch belonged to your great-grandfather Charles. He wore it at every important moment in his life, especially when he was watching the stars. I thought you might want to have it today." Lucas's eyes widened as Victoria delicately pinned the brooch to his hospital pajamas. "It's like having a little piece of heaven with me." Dr. Chen entered the room, accompanied by her team. "Are you ready, Lucas? Your father is already in recovery, and the marrow is being prepared." Rebecca felt her heart speed up. This was the moment that would determine whether the last 10 years of separation, pain, and hope would culminate in a new chance at life for their son. "Can I see Dad first?" Lucas asked. "He's still under anesthesia," the doctor explained gently. "But as soon as you wake up, I'm sure you'll come straight here." As the team prepared Lucas for transport, Rebecca noticed Martha standing discreetly in the doorway, holding her great-grandfather Charles's telescope. "Lucas asked to bring it," she explained. "He said he wanted it to stay in the room, pointing to the sky while he was in surgery." Victoria surprised everyone by taking the initiative to personally position the telescope next to the window. "That way," she said, adjusting the angle, "the stars can watch over you, my little astronomer." In the hallway that led to the operating room, Rebecca held tightly to Lucas's hand, each step echoing with the weight of the moment. "Mom," Lucas called, his voice shaking slightly for the first time that morning. "Do you think the stars can hear our wishes even during the day?" Rebecca swallowed the lump in her throat. "I'm sure you do, darling. They're always there even when we can't see them." "Then I'll ask them to take care of Daddy too," he declared with a seriousness that broke the hearts of everyone present. At the door of the surgery center, Dr. Chen gave Rebecca one final moment with her son. She knelt down, getting eye level with Lucas. "Remember what you told me about astronauts?" she asked, adjusting the gold brooch on her pajamas. Lucas nodded. "That they are brave for exploring the unknown." "Exactly, and you, my love, are the bravest astronaut I know." With one last hug and a kiss on his forehead, Rebecca watched as her son was taken away by the medical team. Victoria placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, a gesture that would have seemed unthinkable just a few weeks ago. "He's strong," Victoria said softly. "Like you." The next few hours dragged by with agonizing slowness. Rebecca alternated between visiting Daniel in recovery and awaiting news in the waiting room. Catherine appeared briefly bringing coffee and kind words of encouragement. It was almost noon when Daniel finally managed to join them in waiting, still pale and moving cautiously, but determined to be present. "How was he?" was his first question as he sat down next to Rebecca. "Brave," she replied, lacing her fingers through his. "Like always." The sound of heels in the hallway announced the arrival of Victoria returning from a call. "The council sent flowers," she reported, a touch of irony in her voice. Apparently, the news of a sterling heir fighting for his life has humanized the company's image considerably. "Mommy," Daniel started, but Victoria interrupted him. "Don't worry," she said firmly. "I have already made it clear that any attempt to use this situation for publicity will be dealt with extremely severely." Rebecca observed the interaction with a new perspective. The Sterling family was changing, evolving from a cold corporate dynasty into something more human, more real. And at the center of this transformation was a 9-year-old boy who, like the stars he loved so much, had brought light to the darkness. Dr. Chen appeared at the waiting room door, still in her scrubs. Everyone stood up immediately, hearts racing, awaiting the words that could change their lives forever. The expression on Dr. Chen's face was unreadable as she approached the gathered family. The silence in the waiting room was so thick that Rebecca could hear her own heartbeat. "The transplant was a success," the doctor finally announced, a small smile forming on her lips. "Lucas is responding well, and his vital signs are stable." The collective relief was almost palpable. Daniel squeezed Rebecca's hand so hard that his knuckles turned white, while Victoria let out a shaky breath that seemed to contain a decade of built-up tension. "When can we see him?" Rebecca asked, her voice cracking with emotion. "He's in the pediatric ICU right now. The next 48 hours are critical," Dr. Chen explained. "You can visit briefly one at a time, but you need to prepare yourself. There is a lot of equipment and monitors. It may seem daunting at first." Daniel tried to get up quickly, but staggered, still weak from the marrow collection procedure. Martha quickly brought over a wheelchair, which he reluctantly accepted after a stern look from his mother. "You go first," he said to Rebecca, shaking her hand gently. "He'll want to see you." The path to the ICU seemed endless. Rebecca followed, the nurse through sterile hallways, her heart racing with each step. When he finally arrived at Lucas's room, he had to lean on the doorframe. His little astronaut was surrounded by machines, tubes, and monitors that beeped rhythmically. But what caught her eye most was her great-grandfather Charles's golden brooch, still attached to his hospital pajamas, glowing softly under the fluorescent lights. "Hi, my love," she whispered, approaching the bed. "You were so brave today." Lucas's eyes slowly opened, focusing on your face with effort. "The stars," he muttered through the oxygen mask. Rebecca glanced at the window where the telescope was still positioned exactly as Victoria had left it. "They're right there, darling, watching over you." A small smile formed on Lucas's lips before he fell asleep again. The nurse gently indicated that visiting time was over. Back in the waiting room, Rebecca found Catherine talking quietly to Victoria, while Daniel received detailed instructions on his own post-procedure care. "How is he?" everyone asked in unison. "Woke up for a moment," Rebecca replied, plopping down in a chair. "He asked about the stars." Victoria smiled softly. "Of course he does. He's a Sterling after all. Always looking to the sky, even in the hardest of times." The next few hours turned into a silent vigil. Daniel insisted on staying in the hospital, despite protests from medical staff about his own recovery. Martha organized a low-key rotation, ensuring there was always fresh coffee and small snacks available. It was during one of these quiet moments that Catherine approached Rebecca, offering her a cup of tea. "You know," she began tentatively, "I always wondered why Daniel seemed so incomplete. Even when we were planning our future together, there was something missing. Now I understand." It wasn't something, it was you and Lucas. Rebecca studied the face of the woman who almost married the father of her child. Catherine, You don't need to say anything, Catherine interrupted, gently. Some love stories are written in the stars, aren't they, as your little astronomer would say. A movement at the door caught everyone's attention. Dr. Chen had returned, her face showing concern. Lucas's fever is rising, she reported. It's a common reaction after transplantation, but we need to monitor it closely. Daniel immediately tried to get up from his wheelchair, but Victoria held him steady. What can we do? He asked, his voice betraying the fear he was trying to hide. For now, wait and trust the process, the doctor replied. His body is struggling to accept the new marrow. The next few hours will be crucial. Rebecca felt the world spin. The possibility of losing Lucas after getting so far was unbearable. Daniel reached out, pulling her close, and she allowed herself to find comfort in his embrace. Victoria watched the couple for a moment before turning to Dr. Chen. Make a list of everything we need: specialists, equipment, medicines. Cost is not an issue. Ms. Sterling, the doctor began, we are already using the best resources available. Then find better resources. Victoria interrupted, her voice leaving no room for argument. That boy is my grandson, and the Sterlings aren't going down without a fight. In that moment, Rebecca saw beyond the imposing matriarch's facade. She saw a grandmother desperate to make up for 10 years of absence, determined not to waste another second with her family. Night fell over Manhattan, and with it came an enforced calm. The telescope in Luke's room remained pointed faithfully at the sky like a silent guardian keeping vigil over its young astronomer. Early morning at Memorial Sloan Kettering brought with it that peculiar silence of hospitals, broken only by the constant beeping of monitors and the soft footsteps of the medical team. Rebecca watched the city from Lucas's bedroom window, the lights of Manhattan competing with the stars her son loved so much. His fever continued to rise, reaching alarming levels. Dr. Chen had increased the dose of medication, but the battle Lucas's body was fighting against and in favor of the new marrow was intense. You should get some rest, Daniel whispered, approaching in his wheelchair. Despite protests from the medical team, he refused to leave the hospital. I can't, Rebecca replied, adjusting the blanket over Lucas for the 1,000th time. Every time I close my eyes, I'm afraid of... She couldn't finish the sentence, but Daniel understood. The fear of losing their son hung over them like a lingering shadow. Look, he pointed to the telescope still positioned in the window. The constellation Orion is particularly bright tonight. Rebecca smiled weakly. You have been studying astronomy. I've been reading every book I can find on the subject, Daniel admitted. I want to be able to talk to him about the stars when... He hesitated, correcting himself. When he gets better. The moment was interrupted by the abrupt entry of a nurse, followed by Dr. Chen. Lucas's monitors had begun to emit more intense alerts. His temperature is a 104 degree free, the nurse reported, already preparing a new bag of medication. We need to act now, Dr. Chen declared, her professional voice masking concern. I'm going to start a new antibiotic protocol. Victoria, who had fallen asleep in an armchair in the corner of the room, woke up to the movement. What is happening? His body is fighting very intensely, the doctor explained, checking Lucas's vital signs. We need to find a balance between fighting the infection and allowing new marrow to establish itself. Lucas moaned softly, his eyes opening with difficulty. Mom, he called, his voice barely audible. Rebecca was immediately at his side, holding his small, warm hand. I'm here, my love. The stars, he murmured. I can't see them. Daniel maneuvered his chair closer to the bed. They're there, champ. We just need to wait for the clouds to pass. Victoria watched the scene with unshed tears in her eyes. At that moment, All the years of social protocol and family expectations seemed insignificant in the face of his grandson's fight for life. The night advanced slowly, each minute marked by the beeps of the monitors and Lucas's labored breathing. Martha appeared periodically with coffee and small snacks that no one touched. Catherine sent regular messages asking about the boy's condition, having created an unexpected bond with the family that had technically destroyed her wedding plans. Around 3 in the morning, something changed. The monitors began to show a change in Lucas's vital patterns. "The fever is breaking," Dr. Chen announced, checking the numbers carefully. "Slowly, but it's coming down." A collective sigh of relief filled the room. Rebecca placed her forehead against Lucas's hand, letting the tears finally fall. "He's always been like this," she said softly. "Stronger than anyone knows. Like Mom." Daniel commented, his hand finding hers on Lucas's bed. Victoria approached, hesitantly touching the golden brooch that still adorned her grandson's pajamas. "Like the rest of us," she corrected. "The strength of the Sterlings combined with the resilience of the Jensens." The following hours brought gradual improvement. The fever continued to drop, and Lucas's vital signs stabilized. As the sun began to rise over Manhattan, its first rays found a calmer room, where hope had replaced fear. Lucas woke up briefly during the nurse's shift change. His eyes, although still feverish, seemed more focused. "Father," he called softly. Daniel immediately approached. "I'm here, son. Do you think there are stars in space that no one has discovered yet?" The question, so characteristic of Lucas even in his weakened state, made everyone smile. "I'm sure so," Daniel replied, adjusting the gold brooch on his son's pajamas. "And when you get better, we can look for them together." "Promise." "I promise." In fact, Daniel gave Rebecca a meaningful look. "I was thinking about building an observatory of my own. Something smaller than great-grandfather Charles's, but perfect for a young astronomer." Lucas's eyes lit up with possibility before being overcome by sleep again. But this time, his rest felt more natural, less plagued by fever. "An observatory?" Rebecca asked when she was sure Lucas was sleeping soundly. "I bought a house in Connecticut," Daniel admitted. "There's perfect land to build one. It's close enough to Manhattan for Lucas's treatment, but far enough away for us to see the stars clearly." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "When exactly were you planning to share this information?" "When I was sure," he hesitated, looking at Rebecca, "that everyone would like the idea." The silence that followed was full of unspoken possibilities of futures that were beginning to appear on the horizon like newly discovered constellations. Autumn arrived in Connecticut, bringing with it an explosion of color that transformed Daniel's newly acquired property into an impressionistic canvas. 3 months had passed since the transplant, and Lucas was making steady progress, although he still needed regular visits to Memorial Sloan Kettering. The house, a 2-story colonial building with large windows and a privileged view of the night sky, was being carefully renovated. The observatory, still under construction at the highest point of the land, was already visible from the balcony where Rebecca was organizing the final details for the first night they would spend there as a family. "Dr. Chen said the latest scans are excellent," Daniel commented, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. "The marrow is working perfectly." Rebecca accepted the cup, allowing herself a moment to reflect. "Sometimes I still have to pinch myself to believe this is all real." "I know exactly how you feel," he replied, sitting down next to you. 6 months ago, I was just another executive living a life others planned for me. Now you are the father of a little astronomy genius who has turned our lives upside down," Rebecca added with a smile. The sound of children's laughter interrupted the conversation. Lucas, still wearing a protective mask, but visibly stronger, ran through the garden with Victoria, who had surprised everyone in recent months with her transformation from distant matriarch to a completely devoted grandmother. "Grandma, look!" Lucas called, pointing to a monarch butterfly that landed on a nearby bush. Her colors are like a nebula. Victoria, who now always carried a small astronomy guide with her, a gift from Lucas, smiled. You're right. It reminds me a lot of the Crab Nebula, doesn't it? Daniel and Rebecca exchanged admiring glances. The change in Victoria was perhaps the most surprising of all the transformations their lives had undergone. Martha, who had chosen to continue working for the family even after moving to Connecticut, appeared on the porch. Lunch is served and Catherine just arrived. The mention of Catherine no longer caused discomfort. In the months following the transplant, she had become a constant and welcome presence, developing a friendship with Lucas based on their shared interest in astronomical photography. I brought the photos of the last meteor shower, Catherine announced, walking up the porch steps with a folder in her hands. Lucas, you won't believe the images we managed to capture from the university observatory. The lunch took place in an atmosphere of family intimacy that would have seemed impossible months ago. Victoria discussed with Lucas the technical details of the new observatory, while Catherine showed her photographs, and Martha served a specially prepared meal to strengthen the boy's immune system. I have a surprise for you, Daniel announced when everyone had finished eating. The architect has sent the final designs for the observatory, and there is something special he would like to show you. He unrolled the blueprints on the table, revealing not only the design of the observatory, but also a sign that would be installed at the entrance Charles Sterling Observatory where dreams touch the stars. Daniel. Victoria murmured, her hands shaking slightly as she touched her father's name on the drawing. I thought it would be appropriate, he explained. After all, it was his love for the stars that somehow brought us here. Lucas studied the drawings intently, his eyes shining with excitement. Can we really see the Milky Way from here? With the right equipment, we can see much more than that, Daniel replied. In fact, I've already ordered a special telescope that should arrive next week. Rebecca watched the interaction between father and son with a full heart. In her darkest moments during Lucas's illness, she never could have imagined that they would find not only a cure, but also a complete family. Rebecca, Catherine called softly, noticing her moment of contemplation. Sometimes the universe has bigger plans than ours, doesn't it? Yes, she agreed, watching as Lucas now excitedly explained to Victoria some technical detail of the project. Sometimes we just need to trust the path the stars lay out for us. The rest of the afternoon was spent exploring the property and making plans for the future. Lucas, although he still needed to rest frequently, was getting stronger every day. His passion for astronomy, far from diminishing during treatment, had become a point of unity for the entire family. As the sun began to set, painting the Connecticut sky in shades of pink and gold, everyone gathered on the porch to watch the spectacle. Lucas, sitting between his parents, held his great-grandfather Charles's golden brooch, which now rarely left his side. You know, he said thoughtfully, I think the stars knew what they were doing when they brought our family together. Victoria, who was nearby, discreetly wiped away a tear. Catherine smiled, capturing the moment with her camera. Martha brought hot chocolate for everyone, a new tradition for her family astronomical observations. Yes, my love, Rebecca replied, hugging her son. The stars definitely knew. Daniel rapped, his arms around them both, his gaze meeting Rebecca's with a silent promise of love and commitment. Above them, the first stars of the night began to appear, silent witnesses to a story that, like the constellations themselves, had been written long before any of them realized it. A year has passed since the first night in the Connecticut house. The Charles Sterling Observatory, finally completed, stood majestically against the night sky like a beacon of hope and new beginnings. Lucas, now 10 years old and completely recovered, was preparing for a special moment, his first lecture on astronomy to his classmates. And here, he explained excitedly, adjusting the observatory's main telescope, we can see the Pleiades star cluster. The ancient Greeks believed they were 7 sisters dancing in the sky. Rebecca watched from the doorway, her heart overflowing with pride. Lucas had not only overcome his illness, but emerged from it with a strength and maturity that impressed everyone. Great-grandfather Charles's golden brooch, now permanently affixed to his favorite coat, sparkled under the soft lights of the observatory. "He's a natural at this," Daniel commented, approaching silently. "He has the gift of making people fall in love with the stars as much as he does." Daniel's transformation over the past year had been equally remarkable. Away from corporate pressures, he had found his true calling, dividing his time between remote financial consulting and an ambitious project establishing a foundation to help families with children facing serious illnesses. The Estrella Guia Foundation has already approved funding for 3 more families this month, he continued as they watched Lucas patiently answer questions from his fascinated colleagues. Catherine has been amazing coordinating the psychological support program. The mention of Catherine brought a smile to Rebecca's lips. Daniel's ex-fiancée had become one of the family's greatest allies, transforming her passion for photography into a therapeutic tool for children undergoing treatment. Victoria Sterling, who had just arrived for her grandson's special performance, joined them in silent observation. The Sterling matriarch had surprised everyone by selling her Manhattan mansion and buying a smaller house next to her Connecticut estate. "Were you able to convince the board of the company's new direction?" Rebecca asked Victoria quietly. "Surprisingly, yes," Victoria replied with a small smile. "Sterling Enterprises now devotes 30% of its profits to medical research and social programs. Charles would have been proud." The sound of applause filled the observatory as Lucas concluded his presentation. Martha, who had prepared a small cocktail party for the occasion, began serving hot chocolate and star-shaped cookies to the excited children. "And that star over there," Lucas pointed to a bright spot in the sky through the observatory's open dome, "is Vega. It was the first star I saw when I woke up after the transplant." Rebecca felt Daniel squeeze her hand gently. That night in the hospital when Lucas's fever finally broke had marked not only the beginning of his recovery, but also the moment when everyone truly began to believe in a future together. "I have an announcement to make," Daniel said as the families of Lucas's classmates began to say goodbye. Rebecca and I were waiting for the right moment. Lucas immediately focused all his attention on his parents, his blue-gray eyes shining with curiosity. "Your mother and I are getting married," Daniel announced, his smile reflecting the happiness in his eyes. "And we wanted you to be the first to know." Lucas's shout of joy echoed throughout the observatory. Victoria discreetly wiped away a tear, while Martha immediately began making plans for the buffet. "But there's more," Rebecca added softly, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. "In about 7 months, you're going to have a little sister." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Victoria dropping her glass of champagne. "A girl," she whispered, her usual composure momentarily forgotten. Lucas processed the information for a moment before his face lit up with a beaming smile. "Can I teach her all about the stars and show her the constellations and tell her about her great-grandfather Charles?" "Of course you can, champ," Daniel replied, pulling his son into a tight hug. "You're going to be the best big brother a little girl could have." Later that night, when everyone had left and Lucas had finally fallen asleep, dreaming of his future astronomical adventures with his sister Daniel, found Rebecca on the balcony, watching the sky. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, wrapping her in his arms. "How unpredictable life is," she replied, leaning back against his chest. "A year ago I was desperate in a restaurant, not knowing if my son would survive. Now we have a family," Daniel added. "One home, one future, and a little astronomer on the way." Rebecca smiled, guiding his hand to her still flat belly. The soft sound of the door opening announced the arrival of Lucas, still drowsy but determined. "I couldn't sleep," he explained, joining his parents. "I was thinking of a name for my sister." "And which one do you suggest?" Daniel asked, hugging his son with his free arm. "How about Stella?" Lucas proposed. "It means star in Latin. I learned it in my research." Rebecca and Daniel exchanged emotional looks. Their name was perfect a tribute to the stars that had guided their path here, and a promise for the future that unfolded before them. Above the Charles Sterling Observatory, the stars shone with special intensity that night, as if approving of the expansion of this family that had found its way back to each other through the vast cosmos of possibilities that is life. And somewhere, perhaps in a distant constellation, the spirit of great-grandfather Charles smiled, knowing that his legacy of love for the stars would continue to shine through the generations.